Thank you very much. And hearing David's recitation, I'm not sure whether it says I can't hold a job or it's increasingly sounding like an obit. But it's really good of all of you to come this morning, and especially pleased to see, I was going to say several old colleagues, but no, they're longtime colleagues in the audience. Ambassador Nick Platt and Jerry Cohen, two very distinguished colleagues of mine who have long been working on the issues that we're going to be covering. And David, I appreciate the invitation. I was asked to talk about the state of the U.S.-China relationship, the view from Washington. So let me start with Washington. And Washington really means George Washington. And how many of you in the audience know the Empress of China? And I'm not talking about Cixi Taiho. The Empress of China was a commercial vessel that in 1783 was contracted by George Washington and others who had funded our Revolutionary War to enter into the China trade. It was the first official vessel that went to China. It carried over a load of ginseng and other American agricultural products, came back with silks and other Chinese products, and it turned a profit of somewhere between 25 and 30%, which ended up paying off a good part of the debt of our Revolutionary War. So in some remarkable ways that most people don't understand, commercial relations between the United States and China have played a very significant role in our history. The Delano family, as in Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandfather during the 19th century had made a fortune in the China trade. So President Roosevelt and other members of his family have benefited by the China trade that their ancestors had been able to profit by. Well, with that as a little bit of historical background, let's fast forward to the way that economic relations between the United States and China have become a major factor in China's contemporary modernization. I'm going to skip over the politics of the Mao period during most of the 1970s, but the normalization of U.S.-China relations in 1979 under Deng Xiaoping, who had pretty well tossed out the Mao approach to economic development. His reform and opening policies facilitated the dramatic economic takeoff that we're all aware of, that over 3 decades and more has made China now one of the largest economies in the world. And following the Deng opening policy, the 1980s were a real golden age in U.S.-China relations. Golden age is a way that former ambassador to Beijing, Stape Roy, characterizes the relationship in the first years after the Deng Xiaoping opening period. This was not only a matter of trade developing, but of intellectual exchanges where China was breaking out of the constraints of the politics of the Cultural Revolution period. And I personally had a very interesting set of experiences in the early 80s working with several Chinese intellectuals who had been branded rightists and had difficulties during the 1950s because of their generally liberal attitudes. We were part of a project that translated the Encyclopedia Britannica into Chinese. It was a project that was personally blessed and overseen by Deng Xiaoping. And it was quite interesting to watch our Chinese colleagues cope with a lot of very sensitive issues that were embodied in that translation. What kind of a guy was Stalin? How do you deal with the history of an icon of the communist world? Well, could go on, but the point is there was tremendous intellectual vitality in that period. the Chinese gentleman I worked with went on to found the China Daily, which is now one of the major English language papers in the country. And out of that period, the relationship really seemed to be headed in a most positive and collaborative direction. But then there was a great reversal. That's, I think, the best way to put it. Two events at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the next decade have really transformed the whole character of the relationship. The first of those, of course, was what happened at Tiananmen in June of 1989. And what that was really all about was pressure from younger generation Chinese who were benefiting by the intellectual openness of the preceding decade, who wanted to see politics opened up even further. And the suppression of the demonstrations was really only part of what happened. The Chinese Communist Party leadership split. The Secretary General Zhao Ziyang was purged, and others who were reformists, if you like, more liberal-minded, were removed from party leadership because the party had not found a way to deal, and are still, and we may talk about this later, deal with the public pressures of a society that was being mobilized by the dramatic economic growth that followed the Deng reform. 2 years later, there was a second shock that, as we look back, has had a transformative effect on how China is dealing with its own situation and with the rest of the world. And that, of course, was the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union leadership fell apart, and the country was also, in a sense, disbanded, in the sense that all of the component elements of the Soviet Union flew apart. So in those two events, you had pressures from within Chinese society, and then the threat of the leadership element, as seen in the Soviet Communist Party's collapse, presenting fundamental threats from, if you like, from above and below. So those are two events that are fundamentally in the minds of and issues that the Chinese leadership today is trying to cope with. Despite these two shocks to the system, as I think we are all aware, discipline, political discipline, was nonetheless imposed by the successor leadership after Zhao Ziyang was removed, and China continued on with the Deng Xiaoping approach to economic development, but without the political reforms. This was the period where we were not fully conscious of how powerful the entrepreneurial spirit and the energy of the Chinese people was finding expression in their economic growth. This is the period where Mr. Zheng Bijian had convinced the party leadership to promote the policies of peaceful rise. And the party was aware of the degree to which, given the size and the energy of the country, that much of the rest of the world might become a bit nervous about the growing strength out of China. And so Deng Xiaoping had put forward the policy of Tao Guangyang Hui, or as we translated, the policy of hiding the power that was being generated and biding China's time, hide and bide until China was ready to, what should we say, come out on the world stage. So despite the political impact of these two events, Tiananmen and the collapse of the Soviet party leadership, China continued on with this period of very dramatic economic growth, which, to be sure, has dramatically improved the lives of hundreds of millions of people in China. But there's a great irony in this dramatic growth. Today, the Chinese Communist Party is trapped in that situation of growth, that the consequences of the takeoff have created, to be sure, public expectations about improvements in living. And as I think most of you who follow the situation know, there was a kind of implicit social contract between the party and the population. If you remain disciplined politically, we will keep improving your standard of living. That was the trade-off that was implicit in the growth of the party. But along with that growth have come negative consequences that, again, we're all pretty much aware of from just reading the daily developments in the press. The corruption, the income inequality, the dramatic pollution of the environment that has come with this dramatic economic takeoff. So that today the Chinese leadership is coping with public pressures, if you like, from below that are generated by the fact that the society has been mobilized. Under Mao, the population was mobilized politically from above, all these mass movements, so-called. But Deng's economic development has really mobilized the population from the roots, the rice roots, the ground roots level up. And this has led to the party's effort to control that public pressure, particularly in a society that, like many in the world, is being mobilized by one of the great political gizmos of our time. I think we're, in this society with so many other mechanisms of political and social participation, don't realize how dramatically transformative of politics around the world the cell phone and the internet and all the other IT developments that you'll be talking about today really, really are. The cell phones really were behind the Arab Spring. You have populations that formerly were uninformed that really know what's going on, and more than that, through these cell phones they can talk to one another, they can organize, and as we know in the case of Egypt and other countries in the Middle East, dictators can be brought down by these populations. And so the Chinese Communist Party is trying to find ways to maintain control, even though for its modernization, it needs these communication technologies. And so by the best of most estimates, the size of the internal army of censors who try to keep control of what is being said over the cell phones and over the internet is larger than the People's Liberation Army. And one of the interesting questions is how long those controls will be maintained where the population really does understand what's going on. So today, what is Xi Jinping's game plan to realize the China dream after these 3 and more decades of dramatic economic growth? First, I think he's trying to sustain that grand bargain of improving people's livelihood in return for political discipline. And that means trying, by all means, to sustain an economic growth rate of at least 7 and some percent a year. We know that the recent third plenum, the end of last year, embodied a whole series of economic and related reforms that are trying to cope with the negative consequences of growth, legal reforms that maybe Jerry Cohen will comment about, dealing with issues of energy security, pollution control, and other techniques that will hopefully lead to greater consumerism, greater social services, and respond to that mobilized population. Second element of his game plan, of course, is disciplining the party. This very visible anti-corruption campaign we're all aware of. And finally, he is, in some sense, taking China back to its future, in the sense that his campaign, his efforts to promote Chinese values are based on a pretty evident hostility to what he refers to and what the party documents refer to as Western values. And those of you who may follow things most closely, the end of last year there was a Communist Party document, number 9, which talked about the 7 no's, the 7 things you can't talk about in China. Things like an open press, like constitutional government, like democratization, like human rights, things that are core to our way of life and our values. Xi Jinping is now stressing nationalism, to be sure, with Chinese characteristics. And that is part of what is behind the territorial assertions that have caused so much unease in East Asia, and not to mention in our own country, the so-called 9-line assertions of China's territorial and air space that bumps China up against Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, 3 countries who are allies of the United States. And one can only conclude from what is going on that Xi Jinping's notion of a new model of great power relations is that China really is seeking to regain preeminence, if you like. Hegemony is a harder word, but control over what historically has been its part of the world. The attitude, I think, is, okay, you Americans deal with your problems in your way. We're going to deal with ours in our way, and where our interests overlap, as we saw at the recent summit meeting and its outcomes, we'll try to find ways to deal with our differences. But this is really a conception that I would say really looks like the evolution of a world of spheres of influence. China has its traditional sphere, and unfortunately, this is not the era of the Ming Dynasty or earlier times when China's sway had the kind of outreach that is embodied in the tribute system. China today is going to have to accommodate to a world where, whether it's Korea or Japan or the United States and others, are active in a way that was not the case in traditional times. So where does this leave the U.S.-China relationship today? I would put it in the context of something my old boss, Henry Kissinger, said in the 1970s. Among many things, he is on the record as saying, first of all, countries don't say thank you for what other countries may have done for them. We should be thanking China for its financial support for the American Revolution, right? And should China thank us for having normalized relations at the end of the 1970s, which facilitated Deng Xiaoping's opening and reform program to prosper. The other thing Henry said at one point about 1975, when the Gang of Four was starting to exert its influence in the U.S.-China relationship, is he just commented that when China no longer needed the relationship with the U.S. that underlay the opening under Chairman Mao and President Nixon, that they would not be easy partners to deal with. Which is to say, today, as I view it, the U.S.-China relationship can best be characterized as ambiguous. It's got internal contradictions, Maldun, that make for real uncertainty about the future of this relationship. China can be said, to use an imagery that they're familiar with, is China's walking on 2 legs, but the legs are pointed in different directions, which is making for real tension. And one leg is headed towards the kind of economic activity that will sustain that 7+% growth rate. And again, the outcome of the recent summit meeting, the trade agreement on IT technologies, the visa agreement, the effort to get pollution under some kinds of limits, and the effort to have ground rules for dealing with military encounters in that ambiguous space defined by the 9-long, that can be seen as the positive thing. But the other dimension is the kind of assertion of China's place in the region and the world, which again I think has to be looked at as an effort to reestablish a pattern of, as I say, preeminence, if not hegemony in its region. Xi Jinping now talks about Asia for Asians, and he and his administration have put on the table well over a dozen proposals in the economic and security realm at China's initiative, which, as you see, the way they're structured are really designed to marginalize the influence of the United States in the region and have China assume a major leadership role. And the PLA, the Liberation Army's territorial assertions indicate that that now they're going from what had been the Deng Xiaoping hide and bide approach, keeping a low profile, not being assertive, to what you might call to a show and go approach that is demonstrating now the military capabilities that have come with China's dramatic economic takeoff and using them in a much more assertive way. So apart from the economic structures that are being put forward by China, you also have a similar range of developments in the national security area that are designed, again, to structure a series of multilateral organizations which would implement the Xi Jinping perspective of Asia dealing with its own problems. And in the cultural area, which in many ways has been a very positive layer dimension of this relationship, and my colleague Nick Platt has put a lot of stress on that. Overtly, things can be very positive, very collaborative, very friendly, but within the party structure, it's the 7 no's, it's the indication that the party within its own organizations are there to view Western outside American influence as threatening to China, that raises this ambiguity that the second leg of China's development could very well take the relationship in another direction. So I believe, just to conclude, that the U.S.-China relationship today is quite vulnerable. There could be a variety of unwanted developments, a military clash between a Chinese and an American aircraft, or a Chinese and a Japanese ship that could escalate. The political repression that after Tiananmen led to sanctions and to a real deterioration in relationship could happen again as that mobilized population expresses itself. Economic problems are very significant in the Chinese economy today, bad debt being only one of them, and that underlying hostility reflective of the bad history of China-Japan relations, just as one dimension, could turn out to be problematic. So from a Washington perspective, I conclude that there's growing pessimism about the future of the U.S.-China relationship. And I want to read you a brief summary from the co-chair, William Reinsch, of the annual report to Congress of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, and we're going to be hearing later today from Kevin Rossier, who's part of that operation. Co-chairman Bill Reinsch said he is concerned about what he called the mutual suspicion that is rapidly enveloping the relationship. And this is a somewhat more extensive quote from a letter that Reinsch put over the annual report to Congress from his commission. And I quote, "I've always been optimistic about the relationship, but that view is becoming increasingly untenable as China asserts itself in ways that are inevitably going to bump up against American interests in the region and in the multilateral fora. It appears that the Chinese have embarked on a growth intended to push the U.S. to choose between confronting them militarily or abandoning our friends and allies in the region, gambling that we'll choose the latter. And that includes Reinsch, is a dangerous path." Not a very happy way to start the morning. Again, I appreciate your coming out, and I'm sure we'll have some lively discussion. Thank you.